the panel on the role of the media in producing and disseminating discriminatory discourse and hate speech. Democratic media theorists frequently argue that a key task of the media is to cover diversity, to empower socially, politically, or economically disadvantaged groups, and defy mainstream dogmas. In sharp contrast to this, most of the media, however, through discursive constructions of social differences in negative and highly politicized terms, they promote and reinforce stereotypes, unequal power relations, and social exclusion. This, the media realizes by producing and reproducing schematic categories in terms of which a society represents itself, by defining, devaluing, delegitimizing, and dehumanizing groups felt to be unlike oneself, alien, or threatening. Discriminatory discourse and hate speech visit minorities, gays, foreigners, immigrants, and asylum seekers. Specific formulations, descriptions, or images are used to assign blame, and more importantly, to exclude such groups as pupil and as fellow citizens. This process facilitates the binding or bonding together of all of us into an imagined community and the sending of all of them, who are in some way different, in the words of Sturthol, into a symbolic exile. In passing, let me note that such images, opinions, beliefs we hold about others are artificial constructs. They are made up through selective perception and imagination. And what is perceived often depends more upon the sensitivities and needs of the perceiver than upon the attributes of the perceived. Which identities become relevant for politics are crafted in benign but mostly malignant ways in the apparatuses of discourse, in print, in the press, social media, in textbooks, in TV programs, in all places and all the ways the self and other, us and them, are represented in an expanding public culture, thus providing a reservoir or repertoire of racist images and stereotypes that are drawn on selectively as occasion demands. The logic of such prejudice approach should not be attributed to a pre-social individual psychology, nor it should be viewed as an a priori phenomena demanding explanation, but rather as a discursive construction which has a broader socializing function in shaping opinions and attitudes of groups towards each other, and which provides resources that members can draw upon in talk and text in order to achieve rhetorical and social action. Hence, the emphasis should be on the cultural interpretive resources, the political, historical, and ideological underpinning that permit the creation, reproduction, and dissemination of discriminatory discourse and hate speech, and not only on participants' orientations to prejudice and prejudice-related issues. It was this broader context and the ideological nature of talk that Raquel Dink, the wife of late Hrant Dink, was referring when she called for the questioning of the darkness or the mindset that turns an innocent baby into a murderer. As the murder of Hrant Dink has poignantly demonstrated, the line between hate speech and hate crime may often be very thin. It has been argued that hate crimes often carry important symbolic values. They have sometimes been referred to as message crimes. Hate-motivated speech, crime, and violence communicate a variety of meanings to those who share an identity with the target of the hate crime. Hate crime and hate speech communicate that the other is neither welcome nor safe. The panel today will consist of 2 papers, and our speakers are among the most distinguished scholars who have been at the forefront of theorizing and exploring this very darkness that Hrant Dink had been referring to. Our first speaker is Charles Husband, an internationally renowned professor of social analysis at the University of Bradford and a fellow in sociology at the University of Helsinki. He is a scientific advisor to the UNESCO initiative, the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism. Professor Husband's work focuses on ethnic relations, ethnic diversity, counterterrorism, and the role of the media in producing and reproducing ideologies of racism. He has published widely on racism, migration, diversity, multiculturalism, media, and citizenship. He is the author and editor of several books, including Representing Race, Racisms, Ethnicities, and the Media, which he has co-authored with John Downing. The title of his talk is The Multiple Roots of Hate Speech, a Necessary Complexity for Understanding its Mediation and Impact. Professor Husband.
Thank you. Am I live? Okay, it will be... No, I'm not live. I am warm. Yes, there we go. Okay. I am alive and alive. Regrettably, you can see in front of you a caricature of an Englishman. This is a self-accomplishment, which I apologize for. But beneath this benign, bland Englishness, there lurks a Celtic rage, which I need to recognize. And I've given a great deal of thought to what I want to say today, and in the delusional belief that it might have some relevance to your concerns, I want to stay close to my script, so I stay within my time. But faced with you, distinguished colleagues, fellow students, newfound friends in the Hrant Dink Foundation, it's important to start off by recognizing my humility in facing our shared commitment to equality and human dignity. And if collectively, in the next few hours, we add a little bit to that, then all our time has been worthwhile. So I shall start. As Berkman and Turpin-Petrosin have noted, there is no consensus among social scientists or lawmakers on definitional elements that would constitute a global description of hate crime. On the other hand, Matsuda defined hate speech as being speech that has a message of racial hierarchy, is directed at a member of a historically oppressed group, and is persecutory, hateful, and degrading. I regard that just as a useful starting point for considering the nature of hate speech. We could agree that hate speech is intended to denigrate its targets. It routinely seeks to strip individuals and categories of people of their humanity and moral worth. It strips its targets of dignity and asserts that they are the legitimate targets of the scorn and verbal violence that is directed at them. There are a lot of these. I assumed that my English accent might perplex some of you. Whether it be developed around ideologies of racism, sexism, Islamophobia, nationalism, or homophobia, hate speech seeks to assert the incontrovertible inferiority of those who are its targets. Hate speech serves to assert the legitimacy of ranking individuals and groups into a non-negotiable hierarchy of worth: the good, the bad, the superior, the inferior, the legitimate citizens, and the not-so-legitimate citizens. Nielsen has argued, and I quote, "Public hate speech provides a clear example of one of the ways in which social hierarchies are constructed and reinforced on a day-to-day basis. Consequently, I hope we can agree that at the heart of hate speech is a powerful dynamic that defines the world in terms of a categorical distinction between us and them. And there's a fusion between my argument and Teun's expertise, particularly his capacity to open up the discursive nature of hate speech. We must agree, I think, that one of the core roots of hate speech must be found in the historical construction of such categorical antipathy. The contemporary hatred of people of colour in the United States, in the United Kingdom and in Germany have long histories. And without an understanding of the deep roots of these histories, their contemporary manifestation in the far-right racist organisations, or just as importantly, in the populist rhetoric of mainstream politicians, cannot be adequately understood. There may be common themes of race thinking in these histories, but there are also quite distinct, specific national engagements with people of colour. Halliday, for example, quite properly strongly emphasises the importance of specific historicity in his critique of simplistic accounts of Islamophobia. Preferring to talk about anti-Muslimism, he points to the very important different European national experiences of contact with Islam. Britain, like France, may have had extensive experience of the Muslim world through their histories of imperial expansion and exploitation. But Britain, unlike France, never had its national territory occupied by Muslim forces, and nor did it share France's bitter experience of decolonization in Algeria. When it comes to the deep layers of resentment and bitterness that typically is expressed in hate speech, the distant past is all too often very raw in contemporary imagination. Of course, the existence of deep cultural reservoirs of historically embedded belief and feeling does not provide an adequate explanation of why such stereotypes should have such powerful resonance in our contemporary world. So I want us to ask, how is it, and why is it, that such historical antipathy can be given such current potency? If I may, I'd like to explore a little some of the other factors that we should consider in attempting to get to grips with the current phenomena of hate speech. And I'll attempt to provide an account that reflects my own commitment to being an interdisciplinary social scientist, and I'll pragmatically draw on potential insights from where I will. I never could live inside one discipline, it just doesn't make sense. It might be useful to start with a necessary reflection upon the unlikely possibility that one form of hate speech draws upon a single ideology of superiority. If we consider sexism or racism or class hatred, it's usual to find a strong intersection between the ideologies of oppression that underpin them. In our own lives, we may find it difficult to arbitrarily separate out gender, class, ethnicity, or national identity as they are experienced in their hybrid interaction in our daily life. I can't separate my gender from my northernness. They are mutually self-defining. In the rich literature on identity politics, we are currently routinely faced with statements about the hybrid nature of contemporary constructions of identity. And there's a rich literature on intersectionality of aspects of our being. The notion of a static singular identity is pretty much alien to the contemporary accounts of human social identities. Yes. So too, at the level of pervasive ideologies and their discursive expression, it's usual to find ideologies of oppression feeding into and off each other. Accounts of the racism that legitimated European imperial expansion are, for example, rich in the interplay between sexism and racism. Slurs against the sexual character of specific ethnic groups frequently fuse the majority group's neurotic fixation with sex with their need to denigrate the character of outgroups. If we accept the importance of this interplay between different ideologies of oppression, we can usefully link it to the prior point about the need to locate current instances of hate speech within the particular history of intergroup relations invoked by any particular form of hostility. Thus, yet again, we'll find that we acknowledge the quite specific historical trajectories of in-group identity development and its linkage to outgroup denigration. For example, if we take my country, the notion of Britain as a nation defined by their post-Enlightenment commitment to reason, to law and civility, and her profound Christian moral foundations, sat uneasily with the reality of Britain's involvement in the slave trade, imperial expansion, and colonialism. 19th century British colonial expansion, seen as muscular Christianity, was one instance of the British self-image as a civilizing force in the world, being allied with the brutal exploitation of other people. Such contradictions do not merely coexist. They must be managed through appropriate ideological self-justification. In every country, there are such historical necessities of constructing coherent, positive biographies. These exercises of our past have laid down the infrastructure of complexly interacting ideological packages that underpin contemporary political discourses. If the raw material of hate speech is potentially available within these historical cultural deposits, we might again return to the question, why do they have an appeal and a relevance today? And how is it that they become so powerfully articulated in our society? So in the next few minutes, I want to make a modest foray into some of the elements of the social psychology literature. And if I want to do that, you might say, why would I want to do that when sociology and political science can offer so much to our understanding of the dynamics of hate speech? And I do, in fact, intend to acknowledge that body of work later. It may be possible to see hate speech as an expression of the powerfully articulated ideologies of a particular political regime. If you like, the hegemonic expressions of the interests of a specific historic bloc, to draw on Gramscian ideas. And I'm happy with much of that sort of approach. But as an interdisciplinary social scientist, I want to be able to explain the sheer bloody-mindedness, the venom, the nastiness of hate speech. And I can't get to that through sociology and politics alone. So I have a need to revert to psychological accounts. We need to engage with the ego involvement of individuals in the process of hate speech and of racisms and of other forms of oppression. To do this, I need, first of all, to state a simple and important insight provided by Tajfel and Turner. This is to note the distinction between interpersonal interaction and intergroup interaction. Because for me, hate speech by its nature is a classic instance of intergroup behavior. Wow. When one person directs hate speech at another individual, the first thing they have done is to depersonalize that person. They've denied them their unique personal status, and they've engaged with them solely as a member of the despised outgroup. For example, if a female colleague and I are having a conversation and we disagree, it might be that she would say, "Charlie, you're wrong." In fact, she would say I was wrong. But should she say, "typical male," then she's no longer referring to me as a unique person. I am merely an exemplar of all men, and I carry the burden of patriarchy upon my individual shoulders. It is no longer an interpersonal interaction, two people engaged in an intergroup interaction. So it's for this reason that the salient features of intergroup theory are really important. Because what happens in that intergroup situation is not merely the stereotyping of the outgroup person, it is the self-stereotyping of self. The range of variables we bring to bear are narrowed to the content of our mutual stereotypes. Large areas of commonality are ignored as we enter into a dialogue between us and them, rather than the conversation between me and you. So we can ask, why would any individual allow themselves to be drawn into such a dehumanizing way of seeing the world? The social psychology of prejudice provides one strand of potential insight. Since the seminal work of Gordon Allport in the 50s, there has developed a tremendous reservoir of theory and research on attempts to provide roots to understanding the perverse resilience of Homo sapiens' capacity to denigrate and discriminate against each other. A recent overview of this literature by Jack Davidio in 2005 has provided a valuable summary of much of this research. And one consistent finding is the association of a sense of insecurity, uncertainty, and threat with the potential for individuals to develop a strong capacity for intergroup prejudice. So I would like to make some contextually framing statements about the world we live in. Globally, we live in a world at present, Globally, we live at present within an epoch of rapid change, where, for example, the nation state can no longer guarantee to deliver its side of the social contract to its citizens. Each citizen gives up elements of their own freedom in expectation that the state will guarantee security, stability, and a viable means of living. But the state's boundaries are now porous. Capital flows to labor, national industries are owned by overseas investors, manufacturers close down their enterprise and move to the next area of cheap labor. Families cannot control the flow of information that their children have access to through the web. And middle-class people can no longer assume that their children will have middle-class jobs. Across Europe, we are entering into a world that seems to fit very well Ulrich Beck's definition of risk society. For many countries in Europe and elsewhere, we could reasonably argue that the zeitgeist of the times is characterized by uncertainty and stress. And if I'm right in asserting that, then it puts a general framework around the specifics of any particular country, any particular neighborhood. Within this generic framework, we can locate individuals within the context of their own region, town, and neighborhood and ask, what factors may predispose them to actively engage with hate speech? And in answering this question, one helpful body of theory can be found in Stefan and Stefan's integrated threat theory. Integrated threat theory provides a particularly fruitful perspective on outgroup hostility by drawing on distinctions between realistic threat, symbolic threat, stereotypes, and intergroup anxiety. Intergroup anxiety refers to a personal anticipation of loss of control and of possible personal embarrassment when faced with an intercultural exchange. It is, if you like, a reasonable personal anxiety when contemplating ethnic and religious diversity. What should I do? What do they expect of me? Am I able to perform adequately? How do I feel about this? Intergroup anxiety, if you like, is one of the elements in our relationship with the other, with the stranger. The existence of prior stereotypes about the strange other feeds this anxiety and provides post hoc justification for any avoidance action we have taken. It is their strangeness that has made our avoidance behavior both necessary and appropriate. Stereotypes and the active personal negotiation of intergroup anxiety can become a positive feedback loop. The more anxious we feel about difference, the more we take avoidance action, the more our stereotypes are given legitimacy. Realistic threat and symbolic threat are experienced as an intergroup phenomenon, where the heightened sensibilities of intergroup competition can play a specific and amplificatory role. It's the dynamics of intergroup behavior rather than interpersonal behavior. Realistic threat is associated with economic, political, and physical concerns, issues such as oil supply, competition for jobs and housing, and control of land. It requires us to ask of hate speech, is there something in the world of people that realistically could be construed as causing them anxiety? Not all hate speech is founded on fantasy and ideological nonsense. Much of it is founded on real competition of interest. And the question is how politically that has been manipulated and activated. Symbolic threat, on the other hand, is focused upon a concern with in-group's cultural and moral integrity. This means that in-group identity becomes focused upon the markers of their shared identity, such as language, religion, patterns of family construction, and shared value. Across Europe, for example, the political exploitation of the veil as a marker of difference is an example of symbolic threat, as is the resistance to build in mosques. What is the realistic threat of somebody wearing a veil? What is the symbolic threat of somebody wearing a veil? These are not the same beast. And if we're going to talk about hate speech, we need to be sophisticated in deconstructing its elements. The benefits of employing integrated threat theory and other social psychological models is that they can provide powerful and invaluable insights into the psychological dynamics that may underpin specific forms of intergroup hostility, and into the content and impact of hate speech. The impact of effective hate speech lies in its capacity to tap into a particular form of perceived threat and to make visible and newly relevant the existing negative stereotypes of the outgroup in order to build the legitimacy of this new hate speech discourse. Hate speech as discourse is always embedded within a specific current and historical determination of intergroup relations. And its power resides in its capacity to engage powerfully with the identity and self-regard of those who embrace it. If we have indulged my need to address the psychological dynamics that must be recognized as operating at the core of hate speech, then it's equally important that I should try to return to the question of how the media come to play such a critical part in the dissemination of hate speech. Part of their power lies in their role in agenda setting and framing people's understanding of the world. For all journalism students and communication people, this is old hat, but I think it's still useful. Agenda setting refers to the idea that there is a strong correlation between the emphasis that mass media place on certain issues, based on relative placement, front page rather than back page, amount of coverage, how frequently is this issue reiterated through the press, and the importance people come to attribute to these issues. By making some issues more salient in people's minds, mass media can also place the consideration that people take into account when making judgments about political candidates or issues. Framing, however, differs significantly from this accessibility-based model. It's based on the assumption that how an issue is characterized in news reports can have an influence on how it is understood by audiences. See, I'm not sure whether I'm showing respect or just stopping it for an interruption. Yeah, it's interesting.
If you were singing, maybe you should say stop.
Okay. No. Yeah, it's intergroup anxiety. I hope I don't attract any hate speech. Agenda setting effects assume that the locus of effect lies with the heightened accessibility an issue receives from its treatment in the news. You keep on reporting it, I find it easy to remember it. It's accessible. Thus, it's not information about the issue that has the effect, it's the fact that the issue has received a certain amount of processing time that carries that effect. You have layered down a strong deposit of this issue as central. In contrast, the basic framing approach assumes that the locus of effect lies within the description of an issue or the label used in news coverage about the issue. It's the underlying interpretive schemas that have been made applicable to this particular issue that are central to the effect of framing. The primary difference on psychological level between agenda setting on the one hand and framing on the other is therefore the difference between whether we think about an issue and how we think about an issue. And the media do both. They tell you what's important and then they tell you how to think about it. So that framing and agenda setting, I think, are useful tools for our consideration. For our discussion here, the relevance of agenda setting lies in the power of the media to present a seemingly non-problematic assertion of what are the important issues in our world, whether it be economic crisis, global warming, immigration, terrorism, or demographic change. The media have the capacity to create a consensus about what are the most important issues that should concern us in our daily life. Paul Hartman and I in 1974, when many of you weren't conceived or even thought of, demonstrated this effect powerfully when we showed in England that a consensus had been created about the potent dangers of immigration. And this consensus existed regardless of where we went. Areas of high immigration, areas of no immigration, the same mediated story. And we knew it was mediated because the consensus we found matched perfectly the content analysis we did of the press at the time. A key issue in hate speech lies in the extent to which the media have in different contexts made outgroup hostility normative and legitimate. Around a number of issues, the strong expression of outgroup hostility and in-group preference has made routine and acceptable intergroup competition, intergroup hostility. The global Western media response to 9/11 and the rhetoric of the clash of civilizations, wrapped up into the war on terror, provided one instance of major rehearsal of threat and of the reasonableness of being unreasonable. That is one of the key things about this nature of defining threat. It makes the unreasonable reasonable. Paradoxically, also at a time when the nation state has proved itself to be vulnerable to globalizing forces, we've seen the eruption of nationalisms around the world. The collapse of the Soviet regime has, for example, produced new nationalisms within the Baltic states. And in an era of the ubiquitous permeation of the politics of identity, we've also seen existing nation states fractured by internal nationalist ambitions. The Catalonian situation in Spain being but one of many. And in a world informed by the politics of difference, we've seen identity politics around feminism, gay pride, ethnicity, and disability expressed in national and international contexts. What I'm saying is there is a familiarity with identity politics and in-group preference spread across a wide range of collective identities that makes the framing of a specific issue in terms of in-group preference and rights claims familiar. Hate speech is not a unique and perverse cognitive structuring of the world. It is a particular form of what has become a ubiquitous part of our representation of the world to ourselves. Allport, whilst essentially a social psychologist, was also concerned to address the question of how certain prejudices become salient, and he spoke of the role of demagogues. In his view, demagogues would arise in times of uncertainty and threat and manipulate those fears by arousing public concern and directing fears to specific target groups. Thus, individual frustrations and fears could be channeled towards specific vulnerable groups. All too often today we can see politicians faced with elections or a dissatisfied electorate quite cynically whip up a moral panic around a specific historically primed outgroup. I was teaching in Rome a few years ago when Berlusconi had an election coming up. And behold, his media enterprise launched into a major campaign against the Roma. Quelle surprise. So the normality of the way and frequency with which mainstream political parties engage in xenophobic, racist, anti-Muslim and homophobic rhetoric is critical to our understanding of the viability of hate speech. The research literature is constantly revealing the extent to which strong scapegoating and prejudice towards outgroups is a routine element in national media. Where discrimination is legitimated and hostility towards outgroups rendered normal via the mediation of party politics within a nation, then hate speech operates within a highly supportive socio-political environment. It is not a discourse that is located in its own socio-political space. It's better understood as being located along a continuous spectrum of behaviors. What I'm trying to assert is that there is a natural linkage between mainstream politics and hate speech performance. If we agree that hate speech represents an unacceptable expression of in-group preference, expressed within a specific ideological framework, then we might reasonably ask, what counter-ideologies might the media be routinely disseminating that would provide the basis for challenging the frequent expression of hate speech? Simply, if the media is culpable in reproducing hate speech and reproducing outgroup hostilities, what other discourses can it also reproduce that might challenge that? Since the end of the Second World War, there's been a growth of sensibility that is informed by a commitment to universal human rights. This has been made institutionally concrete in institutions such as the United Nations and developed through extensive academic and NGO engagement with the development of human rights principles and practice. Human rights have enjoyed a near consensual place in the public sphere of democratic societies globally. An appeal to universal human rights for a number of decades provided an increasingly viable discursive framework for considering the appropriate relations between individuals and between groups. More recently, however, it has become increasingly problematic to assume that such an appeal would be regarded as credible. Since 9/11 and the war on terror, with the illegal transnational movement of individuals for interrogation, the use of prolonged detention without trial, the use of torture to elicit information, human rights have increasingly been seen as negotiable, and there's a significant literature on this. Thus, one resource that should have been available to challenge the expression of hate speech has over recent years been weakened. What other counter-discourse may there be that we can hope to find replicated through the media? Well, one discourse that might have provided the basis for challenging hate speech has been the various forms of the politics of multiculturalism with its commitment to positively engaging with difference. Okay. However, over the last decade or so, we have seen many nations retreat from a commitment to multicultural principles and assert a newly confident assimilationist model of coexistence. The media have been an integral element in this process, and in the repetition of a number of counter-narratives to multiculturalism, they have provided their audience with discursive packages that have legitimated this retreat to in-group preference and self-interest. At its simplest, for example, the epithet political correctness has become a potent discursive weapon in challenging any form of policy that is perceived to be unacceptable, externally imposed and favouring outgroups. To assert that this is political correctness gone mad skews any discussion so widely as to suspend the possibility of a reasoned counter-argument. The phrase political correctness has, for example, been the leitmotif of British opposition to local authority anti-racist practice. and the notion of the limits of tolerance as revealed by Blumert and Verschuren in the context of Belgium is alive and well within counter-narratives across the world. This discursive ploy provides a sophisticated means of asserting one's tolerant credentials, whilst at the same time behaving intolerantly. Its core is to assert that if we are to maintain our well-known capacity for intolerance, then certain policies must go no further. They must be stopped. We can only be tolerant within a certain range of reasonableness. This stratagem invokes and rehearses core self-stereotypes of decency, tolerance, and commitment to the rule of law, while simultaneously asserting that there are categories of people who must lie outside the reach of these values. In psychology, if you like, it's the language of delegitimization, and I recommend it to you. And the concept of victimization of the majority, as discussed by Vodek and Matuszek, is the archetypical flexible counter-narrative discourse. At its heart, it simply asserts that everyone has rights except the majority population. It perceives for example, in the British context, the race relations industry, the multi-ethnic mafia, the bleeding heart European Union, as neurotically fixated on the interests of minorities to the detriment of majority ethnic citizens. So we have a whole repertoire of different counter-narratives to accepting and engaging with diversity from a position of the recognition of human dignity and the concern about equalities. Such counter-narratives to multicultural sensibilities, like hate speech itself, do not find their way into the media by some random process of journalistic xenophobia, but must be understood as a logical expression of the political economy of the media in any specific country. Patterns of ownership and control heavily shape editorial policy. The usual relative absence of members of the targeted minorities from employment in major national media additionally add to the cultural and political centre of gravity of any media organisation. And the routines of news production tend to ensure that a relatively narrow range of voices are heard within the media. Content analysis of the media frequently reveals that members of minority communities typically exist as objects in the media rather than as subjects with a voice. They are spoken about, but do not speak. Can it be, in summing up, that the hate speech and other manifestations of prejudice enter into the media via mechanisms that are unknown to media professionals? Am I to allow them a veil of ignorance, to refuse to condemn the evidence of research? It seems to me to be unlikely. National professional bodies and the International Federation of Journalists have for decades actively produced codes of practice and provided guidelines on good practice. Schools of journalism increasingly include elements that require journalists to understand the ways in which they may be culpable in reproducing prejudice and damaging copy. Ignorance, I think, is not really available as an explanation of how it is that media professionals provide a context in which hate speech and prejudice is recycled through the media. It seems much more likely that the communities of practice, the workplace cultures and organizations in which media professionals practice, can account for their capacity to continue to service prejudice and xenophobia. For example, if you look at the extensive literature on police and the cop culture, it's easy to find evidence of senior police officers with a strong commitment to challenging racism in police forces and to pursue equality. The evidence is that their capacity to change working place culture is undermined by the strength of cop culture. The street cop and the peer group support that requires is much more powerful than strong messages coming from above. And I think so too in the media of journalism and news media. It is workplace cultures that are part of the problem of professionalism and routine practice. So in concluding, I've not sought to trace the detailed construction of specific speech acts and the deconstruction of discourse. That is very much an area of expertise I do not possess. But I've rather tried to open up the question of why it is that hate speech is so powerfully present in the world. I've attempted to show that we can only understand the power of hate speech if we consciously reveal the conditions under which it is produced and experienced. Audiences are not passive victims of the media, and we must consider what concerns and values they bring to the media. We must consider the role of the active audience, both in their selective preference for specific media and their selective perception of the content of media. Where, for example, we have strongly xenophobic nationalism and members of the public actively choose to read newspapers that reflect right-wing nationalist and racist views, then we can expect a significant reinforcement of out-group hostility. So to conclude, I would like to assert that we have reasons to be anxious about the capacity of journalism to self-regulate. They have historically proven their inability to regulate their reproduction of nationalist and discriminatory sensibilities. We have a concern about a need to deconstruct the word we are talking about today, hate speech. Hate speech should not become like Islamophobia, a word we all use and assume we mean the same thing. There is no such thing as Islamophobia. There are many forms of Islamophobia. Each one needs to be deconstructed into understanding how and why it works. So too, I think it is dangerous to start to talk in some generic sense that we have an agreed position on hate speech, without first of all agreeing how it is we are going to deconstruct our understanding of what hate speech actually is and how the media reproduce it. Thank you very much for your tolerance. Thank you.
Thanks for this very clear presentation, very insightful presentation, and very enlightening presentation. Now we have a question and answer session for 15 minutes, but before we get started, a quick note. It seems that new headphones for translation have arrived, and if you need, they are probably outside. Kulaklıklar gelmiş.
We have the headsets, so if you need more headsets, I guess they're outside. Okay.
So the floor is open for questions. No questions? Or
Someone has to be the first.
In the beginning of the conference, Mrs. Yumul has talked about Stuart Hall, am I right, Professor? And she talked about the concept of symbolic exile. Could you please, I'm asking Mr. Husband, could you please tell a bit about what symbolic exile means? How can we treat it as a concept in media discourses? Thanks.
It's quite simple. I haven't the slightest. I said, am I back there? It's quite simple. I haven't the slightest. Because symbolic exile is a concept I haven't used myself. It is a concept I've come across, and I recognize it as a concept whose time might have arrived, because it potentially provides a vehicle for explaining a lot. But I'm not sure how we should use it. So I myself would be rather resistant to engaging in talking about symbolic exile, precisely because it's not a concept I would use. I'd rather break it down into its constituent parts and try and explain what is it we are talking about. But You might want to talk about it.
All means who are not seen as constitute parts of the nation, the ethnic group, the religious group, etc. Even if they exist within that country, they are seen as strangers, or they are seen as non-existent people. That's what Stuart Hall means when he uses the concept of symbolic exile. Thank you.
Your speech made me think about, or made me remember, Zygmunt Bauman's book Legislators and Interpreters, because hate speech is so much related to hate crime in some countries, not in many countries maybe, but in some countries. So the legislator or the lawmaker anyway should make something clear, should clarify the definition of hate speech and also the related hate crimes. So the high level of sophistication of your approach and definitions sometimes make difficult for the lawmakers to make a clear-cut legislation process. For example, you talk about Islamophobias, not so the aim, the direction of it, the intention or whatever. You know, there are many levels, and you gave a wonderful speech about these different layers, framing, agenda setting, whatever, many things. So how this difficulty can be transcended? Or sometimes I think that lawmakers should also appear in these settings and try to understand what we are saying.
About perhaps 25 years ago, I spent 2 successive wonderful summers working with Professor Pascal Boucaud and Alpha Connolly from UCD in Ireland. They are both academic lawyers. Professor Boucaud is the professor at the Institut de Droit de l'Homme in Lyon. And we spent all our time dialoguing, and they kept saying to me, you can't say that, you can't say that. So I found as a social scientist, talking to academic lawyers was a deeply enriching experience, because it revealed that we have a limited capacity to dialogue. But it is possible to dialogue, and I think one of the things is, what do we expect of law? And the first thing about law is, that from my naive understanding, and there are jurists in the room, law is always interpreted within a particular context. And one of the things about changing law is to move a benchmark along to require a new debate about how shall we interpret it. So if you don't have a particular law, then the nature of the debate is of a different order. So, for example, if you look in Britain, we passed a series of anti-discrimination acts. Yeah? Now, for me, the crucial breakthrough was when the 76 Act introduced the concept of institutional racism, systemic racism. Because although it came from social science and from North America, what it did for law was to say, you no longer have to demonstrate intent. Discrimination had been illegal prior to that, but frequently there was a need to demonstrate that the intent of the person was to discriminate against you. And the power of the linkage between social science and NGOs, which were crucial in the shift of that legislation in Britain, and law as law, was that there grew up an understanding of what systemic discrimination meant. And what it cruelly meant was nice people can discriminate, and that's why there was so much resistance to it. As long as we had discrimination defined in terms of hate, we had to demonstrate the intent of the hater to cause harm. Once in law, we had the possibility of talking about systemic discrimination. All we had to demonstrate was that the consequences of your routine behavior are in their effect discriminatory. And that shifted dramatically both legislation and, more rapidly after the legislation had changed, practice. Because people knew that you could no longer hide behind your nice decency as being a glorious example of English tolerance like myself. I knew that I was always going to be vulnerable to women saying to me, You may not actually hate me, but you are part of a paternalistic system in which men keep reproducing privilege, and whilst you may like me a great deal, you are part of a system that disadvantages me, and I'm going to act against you. So I think there is a dialogue to be had between law, and usually, from my innocent perspective, we only understand the power of law once it's been enacted. For example, over hate speech, there is a fear that if you bring in legislation to counter hate speech, it will be used to block other forms of discourse which we believe should be permitted. One answer to that is, what it reveals is just how systematically oppressive the regime is.
So there cannot be universal law of hate speech or hate crime because it depends on the countries.
There can be a universal law. I mean, I could conceive of a situation in which we add to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or some international instrument like the European Convention on Human Rights, and we find a form of words which outlaws hate speech. But its interpretation would always be dependent on the legislative and cultural context of the country. For example, in my lifetime, it was possible to read what used to be called dirty books, because we had a famous court case in which it was proved that D.H. Lawrence was a major author, not a pornographer. Now, D.H. Lawrence hadn't rewritten his books. What had happened was the cultural environment in which people looked at literature had changed, and certain pressure groups were able to argue that the law no longer could be applied to this mode of literature. And we've seen it in similar areas too, where the law doesn't necessarily change, but an understanding of what it can be applied to can change. When the 1965 Race Relations Act and the 68 Race Relations Act came into Britain, which was to outlaw discrimination against people of colour, the majority of the people to be first prosecuted were black. Right? Should we have been surprised? No, Britain was a racist system. But the outrage against the use of the law in that way produced the next wave of interpretation of the law, so that it's a dialogue. It's a dialogue between NGOs, pressure groups, and civil society, and the state, who believes it owns the instruments of law. So I don't see simple solutions. I see law as a fulcrum for points of contestation, in which some people argue that a law should be brought in, and then we see how it's interpreted, and lots of other people come in to argue about how it should be interpreted. Not sure that helps, but it's a typical social scientist's answer. Yeah.
Oops. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Somehow, yes, now it should be better. I'm a lawyer, and I'm also part of the Community Volunteers Foundation, that is a partner to the Hrant Dink Foundation. And my question would go to the social media that somehow you didn't touch much upon, and how we could step in to regulate and alleviate hate speech there, especially provided that there is no common ground for interaction and intervention by any international or state actor. And secondly, what could be on the very grassroots level a reaction by an individual or a group so as to prevent or at least to recognize hate speech. Thank you very much.
My first answer is you'd be amazed at the number of things I didn't say in my speech. A large part of preparing it was choosing what not to say. But yes, the social media are absolutely central. And where to start? The first thing is, how do we, from a national basis, regulate something that is located internationally? I mean, I don't know what's happening in Turkey, but I, for one, am deeply distressed that Google tracks my activity, that every action I take through the web is tracked, as part of a data set about me, Charlie Husband. I resent that deeply. Who is going to act on my behalf, and how do we engage in contesting Google? In terms of hate speech, there's two things I would say to be brief. One is that if you can identify the source, which isn't easy, then you can prosecute within national jurisdiction. That if I use social media in Britain to make a global statement of hate speech, I can be convicted under British legislation of uttering. The other thing is that unlike the mass media, hate speech is much more dynamic. That if you looked at the production of fitna, an offensive piece of material, one of the things that the social media did, which the national media didn't do, was to rapidly allow people to respond in a variety of ways. One was through jamming. Very rapidly, lots of people from all sorts of backgrounds produced very small programs, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, with the same title, Fitna. So if you wanted to track this offensive piece of video so you could go on the web to see it, you suddenly found when you clicked on Google, you got 500 references. And you couldn't easily work out which was the one you really wanted to get in touch with. Similarly, you find on the web, people put up a whole lot of statements saying sorry. There was a whole lot of people engaging in the social media to use the existence of fitna to say, we dissociate ourselves from this material. It is offensive, it is unacceptable. How often do national media provide vehicles for people to spontaneously declare their resentment, their resistance to oppressive utterances? Hardly ever. Most media have a very limited range of usual suspects who have access to the media to be quoted. The great thing about the social media is it is a perverse form of democracy. Somebody called it placeless publics. Rather than the public notion of the public sphere in a particular state, it's a diffuse public. So I have hopes for the social media as a necessary counterbalance. But how to regulate something that is by its nature international? I have no quick and easy wisdoms for you. None.
Have other questions?
Türkçe sorabiliriz değil mi?
Can we ask in Turkish? Yes, can you hear the interpretation? Well, a person who develops hate speech, how can we actually interpret his psychology? Should we say that a person who generates hate speech is psychologically ill? Especially thinking about hate speech in Turkey. Should I repeat? Can you hear us? Duyabiliyor musunuz? Channel 2. Can you hear us? Channel 2. Channel 2 is in English. Can you hear us now from Channel 2? Can you hear the interpretation now? Can you hear? From second channel. Okay. 2. Channel 2. Can you hear? Can you hear now? Can you hear us now? Okay. Okay. So I can talk, I guess, says the speaker. Yes. From the perspective of Turkey, a person who generates hate speech or even a person who commits a hate crime, how can we interpret the psychology of that person? What kind of a term shall we use? Is that a psychologically sick person or hate speech? Is it in line with the human nature? Is it something normal, or should we call that person a sick person?
I'm very resistant to pathologizing people in psychological terms. Most racisms, most ideologies of oppression are learnt ideologies as part of people's collective socialization. You do get some individuals who have a personal psychological need for their racism, and we can find evidence of that. If you look at social psychology studies of attitudes, I think it was a guy called Nicholas Deakin who talked about the unlovely 10%, that in any attitude survey on any particular issue, you are likely to find 10% at the extreme who are very extreme people. And it may be that those persons do have some of the dynamics I was talking about, of having a personal need to be able to express their hang-ups. Because there's a great deal of hate speech is in fact projecting our hang-ups onto other people. But predominantly, I think, what we see in hate speech is people drawn into a sharing of a discourse which they regard as normal. I've got people in the village where I live who will refer to some of our other people in the village as Pakis. I don't think that they're venomous, screwed up people. They happen to be good citizens of Yorkshire who have acquired in their socialization a particular deposit of English imperial views about people of colour. And I think these people are normal, nice people, but they have, in their socialization, come to share a set of values, of beliefs, of stereotypes, which there is a consensus, or there has been a consensus around, so they can rehearse it. It is normal, not abnormal. So my answer in concrete terms would be, there are some individuals who you could probably argue there are strong psychological underpinnings to their extreme engagement in prejudice. You could argue that every one of us uses outgroups to define our in-group. Every one of us is engaged in trying to sustain a sense of personal integrity, personal worth, by saying, the people in my in-group think I should belong, they value me, therefore I'm good. But also comparing yourself to people in outgroups. For example, when I was a kid at school, 16, 17, I was what they called athletically challenged. I was tall, the same weight, and pretty useless. You know, if God had wanted me to play football, he'd have put my brain nearer my feet. So what did I do? I found other athletically challenged colleagues, and we established a rugby club. And our ambition was to get beaten by the biggest score we could manage. Our glorious point of triumph was being beaten 50-0. Now, the sportsmaster hated us, but we were so pleased that we had celebrated our glorious collective incompetence to orchestrate our limbs. And I think all of us do that. We find, so you know, you can imagine how we felt about the real sporties. You know. I mean, so we construct in-groups and out-groups. We all do it. It's normative. And that's why it is so easy for hate groups to develop a capacity to make us focus on a new out-group and make them pay for it. Because it's only a shift along a continuum of what is pretty much what we do routinely.
One last question. Here.
Can I ask a question? Do you hear me? Okay. Nowadays we have attempts to enact hate crime legislation in Turkey, and there are a lot of intellectuals who want to dissociate hate crime from hate speech because they are afraid that hate speech legislation might curtail free speech and the freedom of expression. Now my question is it possible to enact a hate crime law without making reference to hate speech or without limiting the use of hate speech in daily language? Thank you.
kept the best till last. I think in law you can draft legislation any way you want, and it would be possible to draft a piece of legislation which said it is illegal to engage in any activity which causes harm to specific target groups. So a generic law that would outlaw discrimination on the basis of identity, any identity. And then you could say discrimination in employment, discrimination in services, discrimination in refusing mutual human dignities. And you'd have to demonstrate the nature of the harm. I think there is a problem for me that I've had to focus on since I've come to Turkey just a few days ago, which is the dialogue going on here between hate crime and hate speech. Now, I started my paper by saying there's no definition of hate crime that there's a consensus on. So you want me to answer a question where I revert to my first opening statement and saying, I'm not sure what we're talking about. So I think one of the answers in a way is what legislation would you currently have in place that would allow people to seek protection of their personal dignities? And the other thing that I was trying to say in my paper is it doesn't matter what legislation you put in place, what other values exist in your country that will inform the interpretation of that legislation. Because legislation against hate speech assumes that there's a complementary set of values which are about human dignity, about equality. So the problem we've got, for example, in the United States is that the First Amendment out-trumps the 14th Amendment. The Americans are very clear that freedom of speech is more important than protection of human dignity. Across Europe, we've got many states that are not at all comfortable with that and have a much more balanced relationship in which we can assert that the law will protect your dignity. So one of my first questions would be, in Turkey, do you have an environment in which there is a consensual view that human dignity is a value which you all collectively share and assert? If you have that, the next question is, what legislation reflects that value? Because that legislation will inform how you develop and interpret your legislation on hate speech. And if you haven't got those values, how on earth do you expect to prosecute people for hate speech if there's no values that explain why it's a problem? Because hate speech is an assault on dignity and equality. So if you have no protection for dignity and equality, legislation on hate speech is a stool with only one leg, and it takes some careful sitting on. So you need the other legs to the stool.
If you allow me, there's one more question from Raquel Dink. Please. Mikrofonu alabilir miyiz? Raquel Hanım. Buraya. It's again in Turkish.
Şimdi özür dilerim. Benim eşim nefret.
Let me apologize. My husband was assassinated because of hate speech and because of discrimination. So my question is, let's say a group of people, a group of citizens, they actually threatened my husband, and they told him that he was the center of their threats. And even on the media, this was not featured and covered at all, and the legislative bodies, they did not do what they were supposed to do, and thus my husband was killed in the end. So there was an action. I mean, it wasn't just speech, it was a crime as well. And we were told that we are either to love Turkey or flee Turkey. And they told my husband that he was the target of their hatred. He also said that he could be a victim one day. And the Prime Minister also uttered the same sentence: love this country or flee this country. And as far as I'm concerned, and God preaches this as well, if you don't love your fellow human beings, then you are lying if you say that you love God and you love God, you follow God's teaching. So what is it, and what is wrong here? I mean, is it how these people were brought up? As someone who has been studying these topics, what would you say, and how can we seek a way out? Thank you.
There is nothing an academic can say that will ever compensate for the loss of your husband. It's very difficult to respond to a question with that background behind it. The answer, in a way, from my personal perspective, is those sorts of crimes tend not to be individual. They can be individual. The guy in Norway, for example, who killed so many young people, personally motivated, personally carried out the crime. But from your description, it sounds as though this was collectively developed. Where you have got a group of people who share a strong belief, they have a capacity to facilitate an escalation of their commitment to the belief, and they have a capacity to carry that belief into practice, which an individual wouldn't do. Social psychology has a lot of literature about that. So I think where you have a country in which people are able to form collective groups, for example, in Britain, we have lots of people who don't like Muslims. It's cultural. It goes back to Orientalism. We've got a whole repertoire of ambivalent feelings about Islam. We value the history of Islamic art, Islamic culture. We know that we owe so much to the Islamic world in terms of contemporary science and values. At the same time, as imperial oppressors, we have other views about Islam. I went to see a ballet in Helsinki with my wife, and all the ladies were dancing around wearing very little because it was a harem. That was okay then. It's the Orient. So we still today rehearse visions about difference that have a very strong historical root. And we also have in Britain the EDL, the English Defence League, which is a far-right organisation who have only one political platform, anti-Muslim. Now, when you get an organisation like that, I find myself starting to answer your question. The fact that in my country, Islamic stereotypes, anti-Islamic stereotypes, a strange range of positive and negative stereotypes about Islam and about people from particular countries exist. But when you get a political group who are mobilized with an explicit platform to kick Muslims out of the country, things have changed. They haven't just changed politically in the sense that people now have a platform where they can rehearse their views. They have changed in terms of the dynamics of the individuals who get together as the core leadership of that group. They organize quite deliberate street activity where they hope to incite people like me to go on the streets to oppose them, so they can then claim that there is civil disorder because people will not allow them freedom of speech, and they speak on behalf of the true British. I am a lunatic left, and as a lunatic lefty, I should be put in my place. So that they have a very clear political strategy which has an ability to build support and to change behaviors. They are trying to legitimate street violence as a necessary political strategy because the left have taken over political discourse. That is their view. The trendy lefties, soggy multiculturalists, have taken over the British public sphere, and only by the radical intervention of these true Britons, if necessary engaging in violence, can we see a return to the proper Britain. So in a way what I'm answering is that the background of generic sentiments underpins where extremism starts, but much of it, I think, is orchestrated through peer groups developing a particular dynamic. And it is that peer group ability to say, this is okay, we're going to do it. And I think when you see that sort of development, you have to make a distinction between the generic possession of stereotypical and prejudiced beliefs and an intention to incite hatred and to incite violence. And I think the law makes a distinction when incitement comes into play. In Britain, we have legislation about incitement to, and that recognizes that there's something different between sharing negative, antisocial views and actively moving in a political way to incite other people not only to share them but to escalate what you do about them. So incitement to racial hatred is a significant crime in Britain. I'm not sure.
These remarks, it seems that we have reached the end of this session. Now we have a coffee break of 10 minutes and then we reconvene again here. Thank you.